I didn't expect to say this, but Apple may have just proved that my iPad Pro, the device that I use for everything, isn't actually the best tool for the job. And the frustrating part is that it's been beaten by a cheaper, weaker Mac. Hey folks, welcome back to the Weekly Spark. Now, I've been giving the format of the Weekly Spark a little thought, and I've decided I'm going to tweak things slightly from here on in. Rather than working through a stack of stories each week, and because some weeks those stories just aren't there, I want to give a bit more space to a main topic, an opinion piece, if you will, while still bringing in a couple of relevant news stories towards the end. So, grab a cuppa, get comfortable, and let's talk about that weaker Mac. So one of the big talking points that has been getting people's knickers in a twist over the last few weeks has been the MacBook Neo. On paper, specs-wise, it shouldn't really be that impressive. It comes with an iPhone class chip, the A18 Pro, 8GB of RAM, no upgrades other than a storage bump and Touch ID for another 100 smackers, and an RGB display with around 500 nits of brightness. This might be the most honest product Apple has released in years. Because here is an uncomfortable truth. That weaker MacBook Neo is seemingly more capable than my iPad Pro. And I hate that. See, for years, Apple has pushed the idea that the iPad Pro is a computer, and I bought that hook, line, and indeed sinker. They've given it desktop class chips, a quite frankly astonishing dual OLED screen. They developed the Magic Keyboard, which costs about as much as the base iPad model, and they've dressed it up with all the right language. Serious, powerful, pro. But the reality has never quite matched the sales pitch, because at the end of it all, it still runs iPadOS, and iPadOS still feels limited in a lot of ways that matter. Now, the Files app is so much better than it used to be, but it still doesn't feel as dependable or as natural as a proper desktop file system. Browser support is still one of those areas where, yes, Safari on iPad is okay, but it still isn't the same as a proper desktop browser with full extension support. Multitasking has most certainly improved, but it still feels sometimes like Apple is in your face, wanting points for effort rather than actually just getting out of the way. Meanwhile, the Neo, with less power on paper, just gets on with it, even if at times it's a little slower doing so. You've got proper Windows, proper file handling, proper desktop apps, proper browser support, less drama. And that's what makes this awkward, because the real issue clearly is not hardware, and it never really was. There's a lot of noise around 8GB of RAM, sure, and people are saying that 8GB in 2026 isn't enough. They're saying it's stingy, it's short-sighted and classic Apple. And to be fair, there's some truth in that. But Apple has always been very good at making compromises look elegant. But here's where the sting comes in. Give me 8GB on a Mac and I can still do proper work in a proper computing environment. Give me more memory on an iPad Pro and I still hit software limits before I hit hardware limits. And that says a lot. And then there's the price. Because once you look at the £1,299 price tag for an iPad Pro and then add the £349 Magic Keyboard, you suddenly find yourself in a very silly place, staring down at a £1,648 bill for a tablet. Even the iPad Air setup feels awkward. By the time you've spent nearly £950 on the device and its keyboard, you're looking at a £599 MacBook Neo that simply does more. And that, I think, is where Apple has exposed itself. They're charging £350 plus premium for a mobile experience that is, in practical terms, less capable than their cheapest laptop. This is not just a cheaper laptop though, it's Apple not quite admitting that this is the kind of product that gives you the fuller computing experience. Now, I do need to push back on myself a little bit here, because despite everything I've just said, I'm still picking up my iPad Pro every single day. And there's a reason for that. Well, quite a few. There are things that the iPad does better for me than a MacBook like the Neo. And the biggest one is flexibility. I can take it off the keyboard in a second. I can hold it in my hand. I can sit on the sofa with it. I can stand up with it. I can use it like a screen, like a notebook, like a tablet. And that sounds simple, but it genuinely changes how the device feels to use. And then there's the thin white elephant in the room, the Apple Pencil. If I want to design thumbnails, sketch something out, mark up an image, or just work directly on the screen, the iPad with a pencil just feels natural. I can literally hold it and work on it, and that directness is hard to ignore. Now, yes, I fully recognize that this isn't some kind of knockout argument. People have designed incredible things on MacBooks for years. Plenty of people do amazing creative work without ever touching a touch screen. So, I'm not pretending the MacBook can't do creative work. Of course it can. But for me, after using the iPad Pro for so long, it feels awkward to do certain things on a Mac than it used to. And I think that's because I've adapted. I know the workarounds on the iPad. I know the limitations. I know where the walls are, and I know how to move around them. So now when I use a MacBook, even though I know it's more capable overall, now it doesn't always feel as comfortable to use. It's lost its familiarity. And that's a strange thing to admit, but it's true. And there's also something else going on here. Sometimes I actually don't want a machine that makes everything easy to bounce between. Because that's where the iPad, I think, gets interesting. Because I don't think it's really that it has fewer distractions. You can still waste plenty of time on an iPad if you want to. It's more the way that the multitasking works. It's still slightly awkward, but that awkwardness tends to keep me in one place once I've started. On a Mac, moving between windows, apps, files, and browser tabs is pretty much effortless. And it's obviously more capable and obviously better. But it also means your attention can scatter a bit more easily. On the iPad, because multitasking still feels a little clunky despite what they've introduced recently, I often just stay with the task I'm doing and carry on. And oddly enough, that limitation can sometimes help. The iPad's friction sometimes helps me focus. So where does that leave me? Well, there are really only one or two major things that still bother me. I do want a proper desktop browser experience, including proper desktop browser extensions. And despite all the advances, I want a file system that still works that little bit better. And these aren't small complaints. These are important. These are the exact things that make the Mac feel like a proper computer and the iPad feel like it's still trying to become one. The bottom line is that the MacBook Neo is clearly the more capable machine when it comes to software. I don't think that there's much argument to be had about that. But the iPad is still the one I reach for. Not necessarily because it's better overall, but because it fits the way that I now like to work. And maybe that's the real distinction here. The Mac, even the Neo, is about capability. The iPad, it's all about the feels. And that's such an irritating comparison. Apple has made a cheaper machine that looks weaker on paper while also making it more obviously useful for a lot of proper work. And so that leaves the iPad Pro in a really strange place. It's still brilliant. It's still enjoyable. It's still obviously powerful. but it's also limited in ways that feel increasingly deliberate. And I think that's what bothers people the most. Not that Apple can't make the iPad better, but with the Neo, they've shown they clearly know how to, and they've chosen not to do it on the iPad. So I'm curious, if you had to choose one today, a decision has to be made, would you go for the iPad, maybe the Air, or the MacBook Neo? And what would be the thing that swings it for you? Now, before I share two quick news stories, if you are enjoying this, a like would be lovely. Subscribing means you won't miss the next episode, and giving me some hype points, well, would make me happy. A couple of quick stories from the past week. First, Apple has been celebrating its 50th anniversary this week, and it's gone a fair bit beyond just sticking an old rainbow logo on the website and patting itself on the back. They've launched a special 50 years of thinking different page, and Tim Cook has marked the milestone publicly, and Apple's been running anniversary events around the world with Alicia Keys in New York and Paul McCartney at Apple Park as part of it. So the message is pretty clear. Apple wants this birthday to feel less like a museum piece and more like a reminder that its products still sit right in the middle of music, art, creativity, and culture. Okay, moving on. There's a really interesting development in the e-ink space around Remarkable. There's been a fairly credible leak recently suggesting they're working on a new device called the Paper Pure, which is expected to be a cheaper, stripped-back version of what they already do. Sounds familiar. It's doubling down, it seems, on that core idea of a distraction-free digital notebook. There's going to be no colour, no extra features, and no push towards becoming a full tablet with access to an app store. Because while other companies are trying to turn ink devices into mini iPads with cameras and speakers and app stores and all the rest of it, Remarkable seems to be going in the opposite direction. Well, that's all, folks. If you've spotted any e-ink, Kindle or iPad stories you think are worth sharing, please do drop them in the comments and let me know what you think of this tinkered format. Thanks for watching or listening. I'm Mark from the Weekly Spark, and I'll see you in the next one.